think we end here with the first pillar. And take a little time to look at the concept of suffering. What does suffering really mean in the eternal teachings? Beginning with a quote from the Bible and the Old Testament. Look at them. These are the corrupt, yet they are well off and still getting richer. The third book of Psalms in the Old Testament aims at providing consolation to believers in the face of the good fortune of the godless. Another quote from the Old Testament. For I had envied those who boast of their success and begrudged the prosperity of the corrupt. For they have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They don't suffer as others do. They are not afflicted like the rest of humanity. Their eyes gorge themselves on new luxuries. Their taste for extravagance knows no limits. What's the use of keeping my own heart pure and washing my hands in innocence? Psalm 73. End of quote. The godless, whose entire pleasure is the seamy side of the transitory world, who live an entirely normal, unconscious life in the worlds, they are the lucky ones. Suffering is reserved for those who have chosen the inner path, because they believe that they absolutely had to find God, or themselves, or the truth, or whatever it is they call it. Yes, and because they just couldn't let sleeping dogs lie, as they should have done. Does the inner path open Pandora's box? Well, this is a provocative question at the beginning, dealing with the concept of suffering. And of course, these passages, they do not refer to the understanding of what suffering really is, but they refer to the understanding of suffering or non-suffering of an ordinary human being. These statements may document the relationship to suffering of the normal person which has fallen directly into ignorance, yet which adept of the inner path does not know and then feel a pang of nostalgia for the entirely normal life, that time when everything in the world was still in its proper place. The time when one was still stupid and naive enough to be chasing after one's modest pleasures. The time when one still knew one's place. The time when one still had values to give one a sense of direction and didn't have to question everything all the time. The time when there were no illusions yet. The time when one could still naively proclaim, I am who I am, my life is my life, you are who you are, we are all who we are, a tree is a tree, and the world is the world. And What is right because it's always been that way. Which traveler on the inner path has not experienced this in a weak moment? The nostalgia of the lost naturalness of ignorance. How many have given up their happy life to be miserable seekers? This was not my question. This is a question asked by Ramesh Balsekar, an Indian Advaita teacher. But did you really have a choice? But the straightforward evaluation of ignorant can be assigned to these statements, since they somehow mysteriously bear witness to the circumstance of how close together bottomless lies and profound truths are situated. How the simple-mindedness of the mind imitates the simplicity of being. How the lowest understanding can seem to be but a finger breadth away from the highest, and can use the same words to convey it. Thus, the same words can come out of the mouth of a perfect spiritual master as well as the mouth of a normal dimwit whose soul has fallen into a deep, dazed slumber. However, while the spiritual master lives in complete knowledge and awareness of his self, in a fully realized paradise, and has transcended the path of suffering, of separation, the everyday godless person lives in a seeming paradise, which, by the way, sooner or later reveals itself to be hell on earth, and has yet to confront the conscious path of suffering. So here, for the first time in this passage, we have a very important concept. We have been talking today in our interview about the concept I use, the concept of conscious suffering. You mentioned that Gurdjieff, or the Gurdjieff school, used the term of intentional suffering, and we believed both that he meant the same. So after all these passages that provoked the mind of the spiritual seeker at the beginning, we're now coming to the core, looking at the concept of suffering, and this is what we call on the inner path the moment of conscious suffering. Conscious suffering is actually a big moment of liberation, so it's a paradoxical moment. The normal human being, as we know, is trying to avoid every kind of profound suffering and trying to arrange what this person calls my life in a way that suffering is kind of, kept on distance and far away. We can make a very practical example. You see, what happens to persons in their life is so-called traumas, and as we know, most of the traumas, 95% of the traumas, happen in a certain period of life, not as an adult. They happen in a very small period of childish life. So for this, I'm of course I'm interested in traumas. I mean, not setting traumas, but healing traumas. Um, so interested in the concept of trauma. How what is it trauma, and how is it happening? How is it being sustained? This is the interesting thing. It's not really so interesting what happened. Much more interesting when we deal with so-called traumas is how this incident is kept alive. So this is the interesting thing. You see, because two persons could happen. The same thing could happen. Let's say this is just an artificial construction, but let's assume that there are two persons. They have the same accident. I mean, this person here had very, very, very severe accidents and almost died. So another person could have the same accident, but for some mysterious reason, in the one person it's not a trauma, and in the other one it's an absolute trauma. The one person is completely unable to deal with it, and in the other person it just happened. Nothing happens. It just I mean, an accident can happen. A meeting with death can happen. Severe things can happen in war, or you can be attacked, violated, or anything. It's not necessarily a trauma. You see, it's not necessarily a trauma. The trauma is what happens. Let's say it begins. You see what happens in the next moment. The next moment. You see, the next moment, not the moment of the incident itself, but the next moment is what causes the trauma. Yes, why have I been talking about this, by the way? Sometimes lose the thread. Wait a minute. Okay, I will re-find the thread, but at the moment I just don't know why I've been talking about this. Well, anyway, it was interesting anyway. The end of the path of suffering is apparently identical with its beginning, like an orbital motion returning to its point of origin, thus closing the circle. This means that the seeker returns at the end to exactly where he started from. At the end, it is not even clear whether the path ever existed or whether it was entirely an illusion of one's own mind. Well, this refers to what was said before in the passage, that we cannot believe in the truth of words. Words, or even in the truth of a state of union. This can be a very simple pre-rational state, or it can be a transcendental state. I remember a situation in a darshan with another teacher I know, with the master. Someone said, I would really love to, when I see these enlightened cows on the meadow, I would like to be in this state. Yes, but the master said, well, the enlightened cow might be, he said other words, but the sense was, that the enlightened cow is definitely also a state of union. It's not a dualistic state. So the cow is in a non-suffering state. You see, The cow does not suffer. When you hit the cow will have pain. But the concept of suffering, you cannot. Is not the way we understand here in the wisdom teachings the concept of suffering. But the cow is living in what we could call the unconscious paradise. The conscious paradise is the state which has transcended suffering. The cow has not transcended suffering. It's a pre-suffering state. Yes, this whole passage, and this is going on, is dealing with the similarity of the seeming proximity of ignorance and simple-mindedness and the transcended simplicity of being. Not a single step has been taken, and the journey is long since over. The tongue has not moved, and the teaching has long since ended. This is one of the highest teachings of Zen. But it takes a great deal of naivety to think that the intellect, could even begin to understand the teaching concealed in these sentences. As a matter of fact, the teaching can only be received by those who have genuinely and unreservedly embarked upon the path to traverse the obscure landscape of the mind and actually follow it to its end. So-called shortcuts, such as the hedgehog took in its famous race against the hare, are only possible in fairy tales. In this fairy tale from the Brothers Grimm, the hedgehog wins every race by not running at all, simply positioning his alter ego, which is his similar-looking wife, at the finish line, who can then shout out for him, "I am already here." Yet, while the hare, in his ignorance, fails to notice the trickery, self-deception cannot stay hidden in the face of life as a conscious witness. In truth, the last shall be the first, and the first shall be the last. Matthew 20:16. It is the rationalizing mind of so many spiritual seekers that considers itself so clever, like the hedgehog in the aforementioned fairy tale, that it thinks it can anticipate the end of the path and spare itself the conscious experience of suffering along the way. Especially since the modern networked information society now insatiably and unscrupulously blares out, unfiltered, the most secret spiritual knowledge, thus making all of it available to anyone wanting to take possession of it. Since then, all these so-called enlightened and so-called awakened types, who have never really walked through the valley of death, have been popping up everywhere. They speak of stillness when they just mean the calm before the storm. They speak of emptiness and just mean a fade out. Yet the most sublime spiritual concepts, which they have read, snapped up, and taken over from elite wisdom teachings such as Indian Advaita or Japanese Zen. Sayings such as "I already am who I am" or "everyone is already enlightened," "there is nothing to be done," or "live in the here and now," are just so much dead knowledge if acquired second-hand and not from the direct experience of a lived life and an experienced death. Yet, the only chance that any person has to come into contact with absolute reality is to start from the current point of inner experience. What is real must initially be assumed to be that which corresponds to current experience, even if spiritual teachers insist that it's not real. It is not enough, however, to remain there. On the contrary, deep self-exploration has to begin in this point, thereby arousing inner powers of discernment which can separate reality and non-reality. Thus, inner experience might confirm the statements of the spiritual teacher, but then they have become direct, first-hand knowledge. Any other falsified point of departure does not have the power to initiate a process of liberation. The mind's attempt to follow a second-hand path by stockpiling conceptual knowledge of the wisdom teachings or by taking possession of the descriptions of others' experiences seems like a virtually perfect imitation of the pure, naked path of experience. And so it happens that many people for a long time do not distinguish sharply between their first-hand experiences and the knowledge obtained at the thrift shop of their mind, which does a brisk business dealing exclusively in the borrowed knowledge of other mostly long-dead authorities. Upon closer inspection, the path of second-hand spiritual knowledge turns out to be the completely normal path of the average religious devotee or philosophy student whose experiences remain with preordained dogmatic boundaries. But even spiritual teachings which follow neither a particular tradition nor a particular teacher usually lay down explicitly or implicitly constrained value systems which the disciple is expected to adhere. The conceptual scaffolding of spiritual, religious, or philosophical teachings initially serves as an orientation aid for the disciple's mind, as mental crutches while learning to travel the right path. But it must, however, be discarded in order to open up with a beginner's mind, innocently, new, and fresh, a free and unclouded view of reality. Well, well, these passages, they have been dealing with, yes, the ideas of mind that shortcuts could be possible. Imitations of bliss, imitations of happiness, imitations of union states. Yes, we haven't really yet defined very closely this moment of conscious suffering. But I will find the last passage concerning this topic. Would anyone like to make a remark to all this? I have a question. Okay, well, the time is already. Let me take a look. Yes. Let's skip this part and get to the last passage, which I think is quite important about the concept of suffering. It is said in the teachings, and you will know this synonym, that suffering in the wisdom teachings is more or less a synonym for ignorance. The lack of true knowledge. Ignorance means not knowing. Not knowing who I am, not knowing the truth. So this passage, the last one I will read, deals with the difference between ignorance and not knowing. There is a true sense of not knowing, which has to be put to the power of discrimination. So not knowing and ignorance might not exactly be the same. People suffer from ignorance of their true nature, but this is only half the truth. Actually, they don't suffer from the fact that they know nothing about themselves and the world. It is quite on the contrary. They suffer because they know. Because they already know everything, or rather, think they know. The pseudo-knowledge is the most important tool the eye has for stuffing own holes. When it comes to so-called enlightenment, they imagine something like filling up the last gap in their knowledge, which then leads to knowing everything. These ideas of a naive eye evaporate into thin air the first time it has been led to the edge of the precipice and looked down. A bottomless abyss opens up before them. At that moment, the eye has a foreboding of a fall into the unknown, in which nothing from before survives. Ken Wilber says, enlightenment is not all-knowing, but not knowing, the utter release from the cramp of knowledge. Not divine knowledge, but divine ignorance. What you are, therefore, is just a free fall into divine ignorance. End of quote. When scholarship follows inner experience, it is living wisdom. But when inner experience blindly follows scholarship, it is mere puffed up stupidity. The crucial thing here is which comes first. What is it that turns a normal person living contentedly in the world into a wretched seeker of the self? The modest pleasures of the materialist consist in attaining the maximum amount of pleasure with the minimum possible tedium, writes the French scholar and psychiatrist Jacques Vigne. Even the rulers of the Roman Empire knew how to cleverly exploit the cravings of immature people, offering them bread and circuses. Bread and circuses. Okay. Yeah, the saying in German is a little different. Bread and circuses. A normal person doesn't need anything more, even though the adult games of today no longer have much in common with what constitutes a game and what brings it to life. The participants' playful, relaxed attitude. As long as the thinking mind is thereby able to keep people away from themselves and from looking themselves in the eye, this staging will work. Only when the everyday person's attachment to the so-called small pleasures reveals itself as a great self-betrayal, and thus the person's own real suffering, is there a readiness not only to put up with the conscious suffering of the inner path, but also to recognize it as the actual dissolution of suffering. So here we are really getting to the major point. The paradoxical understanding that the moment of conscious suffering is actually the moment of the dissolution of suffering. What we heard here, the maximum amount of pleasure with the minimum possible tedium. This is a way to put the mind concept of how to distance myself from suffering and find a relative happiness away from suffering. This is what the inner teaching would call a substitutional life. Not substantial, but substitutional. People suffer from not suffering. Now this is a paradox. See, this statement might be irritating since, after all, it initially is incomprehensible for the thinking mind, just as every apparent contradiction whose goal is to break through a rigid mental order which serves as a protective wall against conscious suffering. To track down this contradiction, we need to juxtapose the widespread human understanding of human suffering with what wise men consider it to be. To oversimplify, one might say that what a normal person considers to be suffering, the wise person considers to be good fortune. And what a normal person considers to be good fortune is suffering to the wise person. Any comments on the concept of suffering?
What you just said, excuse me, it really reminded me of a saying of a Chinese Zen ancestor, it's better to have nothing than to have something good. You know? Yeah.
Well, we have heard, that the understanding of suffering of the inner path is actually the roller coaster of life, which is sometimes on the good side of life, and sometimes it's on the bad side. But if we observe the happening of this, this roller coaster, it means that you cannot avoid. Once you're on the good side, you cannot avoid of the roller coaster will. It cannot work in a different way, because this is the concept of polarity. So you will find yourself on the other side. It's just a question of time. Sometimes it might need a moment. Sometimes it needs a day, sometimes it needs a week, sometimes it needs a lifetime. But the roller coaster will again go down. There is no way to avoid that. So being in that, sitting in this, what do you call these small cars in the roller coaster? Sitting in this car, calling it my life, prone to these polarities, and not being able to find a way out. This is a symbol for the suffering of the ordinary human being. And as long this is not a simple misunderstanding, but it's a very profound misunderstanding that most people living in this system, they believe that they will find the end of suffering when they're on the good side, finding themselves on the light side, on the good side, on the sunny side of life. And then suffering will end, and then this is paradise, and then they try to keep it, and how can it be? So this is not the concept of suffering, and not the concept of ending suffering of the wisdom teachings. So looking this suffering into the eye, rather than trying to move into a different place, into a better place, falling into it in this very moment, we can experience what is beyond suffering in this very moment. But there's only this one way, and this one way is the fall, and the fall is yes, it's the rift of time.
Quick question.
Yes, please.
So let's use that metaphor of the roller coaster. Where would the wise person be in that metaphor?
The wise person would not be sitting in the car.
So where would the wise person be?
Well, to put it maybe in a simple way that you can understand, the wise person would be in the place of a witness of the roller coaster. We see what is interesting is that of course the fact that this person has left the car in the roller coaster, this might change the direction of the car, not in an intentional way of a mind, but in a cosmic way. So this also is a strange is a mystery to the mind, that simply by detaching or uncoupling the direction of the car within this life called roller coaster is changed. Yes. Yes, so thank you very much. And as I think Beatrice, who came with us from the foundation, she might have mentioned that we have made a small, who is not interested can leave, of course, but it is just a small movie put together that shows a little bit about the background. Rob and Stuart, they also have not seen it, I think. You haven't? No. It's just this very short movie, but it shows a little bit of the background, where we come from, and the monastery we live in Germany.